Today, there are 2 million descendants of French-Canadian immigrants living in New England. These are our stories. Welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Venez tous jeunes filles et garçons, je vais vous raconter l'histoire de notre immigration ici au USA, de grands aventuriers, de pays étrangers.
This is the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast. I am Jesse Martineau, and since I joined the board of the Franco-American Center in Manchester, board members, especially Tim Beaulieu, have told me I really needed to check out the Museum of Work and Culture in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. Well, recently, I did make that trip along with Mike and his wife Morel, and very importantly, our assistant editor, Mike's 4-year-old son, Bryce. And it was an awesome trip. Absolutely cool. And joining us today, we are very excited to welcome to the podcast the director of the Museum of Work and Culture, Anne Conway. Now, in addition to being the director of the Museum of Work and Culture, Anne is also heavily involved in the Franco Route Project, which I'm very much looking forward to talking about. So, Anne, thank you so much for joining the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, before we get going into the museum too much or talking about the Franco Route, I'm kind of curious about your story. So, where are you from?
Sure. So, I am actually from Quebec City. I have been living in Cumberland, Rhode Island, little town next to Woonsocket for 36 years. So my husband and I just celebrated our 36th wedding anniversary.
Congratulations.
Last month. Thank you. So so now Rhode Island is my home, although Quebec will always have my heart.
Of course.
My family is still in Quebec City, so I travel up there on a regular basis, which is wonderful because I get to keep up with my French, which is my first language.
Sure.
And still trying to, get that English language, a little bit better all the time. But I guess when you're born when you're born with a language, it's always your first language is your mother tongue. So yes. And I've been with the Museum of Work and Culture since its opening in 1997. So I studied at Laval University, and then once I got married, I decided to continue my studies here at Rhode Island College. Wanted to really I was already in the teaching field, and I wanted to become a French teacher. Thought that it would make sense for me, so got a degree in French, and then heard about this project of the Museum of Work and Culture, and I thought, well, that would be wonderful. And once you work in a museum, you teach. That's what museums are about, education.
Sure.
And so it made a lot of sense for me. I applied, and I was at the time I had 3 small children. And I wanted just a part-time position, and I knew I wanted a foot in this place. I wanted to be here, so I started as store manager. Believe it or not, as a very
that's awesome.
Yep, just very part-time position, but with an emphasis on getting the right books and the right products to really reflect the museum. So got into the marketing of the place, and very soon after that I became co-director of the museum, and I've been director now on my own for 5 years. But the museum is actually part of the Rhode Island Historical Society.
Sure.
So I'm a Rhode Island Historical Society employee, I guess, and we have other museums in the province area, and it's just a great way to, it's a great association because we have so many people that are so resourceful, in the curatorial department and research, and, we have a wonderful library on Hope Street in Providence, so it really complements what we do here at the Museum of Work and Culture.
That's awesome. Now, obviously, we went down to the museum, which was absolutely a blast for us. Now, is it fair to say that this museum is basically a museum to the French-Canadian immigrant culture down in the Woonsocket area?
Yes, it is. Although we do talk about, the story of immigration, which also includes other ethnic groups, because certainly the French Canadians were not the only group to settle in this area, but they were the largest. So the story is told through the French Canadian experience. By 1920, the city of Woonsocket was 70% French.
Wow.
So when you worked in the mills in in Woonsocket, you really had to learn French if you didn't know French, and especially at the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of the mill owners in the area were from France and Belgium. So it's something that we didn't see in other mill towns in New England. Woonsocket was very unique with the fact that we had a Governor Posier, who traveled to France and did entice some of those manufacturers from the north of France and from Belgium to come to Woonsocket and open the manufacturers. The manpower already spoke French, so that was really why the French was kept for so long. You really spoke French from the top down in Woonsocket. So Woonsocket had really was called the most French city in the U.S. Around 1920.
That is super unique because you hear stories, at least coming out of Manchester. I'm from Manchester, where a lot of workers, there was almost like a ceiling beyond which they really couldn't attain because of the fact that only to a certain point did people speak French. After that, you had to have fluent English if you wanted to be promoted. So that's kind of cool that from the top down that the Franco's all the way through. Now, where did the idea for this? You talked about you've been around since the beginning. Where did the idea come from that hey, we need a museum dedicated to the immigrant experience? Highlighting the French Canadian immigration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the idea of having a museum was really born out of the centennial anniversary of the city of Woonsocket in 1988. So there were year-long celebrations, and the city really felt at the time that there was a need to have a permanent place to tell the story of the workers, of the people who immigrated to Woonsocket, and who really made a better life for themselves and their children. People started to get together, scholars, museum developers, teachers, professors. They came up with a basic story. The project dragged. There was some financial difficulties here. We had a banking crisis in 1990. The project was kind of put onto the back burner. Sure. And then the city, it was about 1995, the city turned to the Rhode Island Historical Society to develop a partnership. And at the time, the director of the Historical Society was Al Kleiberg, already had a lot of experience with museums and experience with, writing large grants for support. So that's really what happened. The society took the management. However, the city of Woonsocket owns the building. So we are in an old mill building, as you know, and the building is still owned by the city of Woonsocket, which is, again, a great partnership for us to have, the city's help and the Rhode Island Historical Society's help.
That is super neat. Now, I did want to start getting into some of the exhibits themselves. And right off the bat, like just when you leave the lobby, you're about to start your journey through this amazing museum. Like the first real place you stop is like a recreated cabin in Quebec, which I thought was pretty cool. Now, can you talk about the city? Obviously, this is a museum dedicated toward the immigrant experience here in the States, but just the impact of having that very first exhibit be before they even decide to leave, I thought was interesting.
It's really where we talk about the push and pull. So what happened, what was going on in Quebec and what was going on here, and why people made the decision. The decision to leave was not an easy decision. People, knew that if they came to New England, came to the United States, they could make more money, sometimes more money that they could spend. And on the farm, when the farms were not producing well, the families were really, really large. For some, it was an easy decision to make, and some others, they didn't want to leave their survivance. So one of the major theme of the museum is la survivance. So, the fear of losing your culture, your faith, and your language was certainly, at the top of the list for people. But those who came to the United States brought their survivance with them. Recruiters often were sent to small villages to bring workers to their cities. So it was done in Manchester, it was done here in Woonsocket, and they were very successful at convincing so many people, because we estimate that about 1 million people left the province of Quebec, probably around 1865 to 1920, to come work in the New England textile city.
I thought that was really interesting because the way it's presented is in the form of like a discussion between a couple of people as to whether or not to go down. And honestly, something that I hadn't spent a lot of time considering, because we've talked a lot about the survivance that you mentioned on this podcast. But the whole idea that that was a major issue that was being discussed even before they left, knowing that that was going to be
Absolutely.
tough once they arrived in the States.
Yes, the survivance was already very important for the French Canadians because of being, that minority in Canada.
Right.
So for them to leave and again, being even, surrounded by the first settlers here, the Yankees and, the English language, la survivance became very important. And that's something that's a theme that you see, as I said, throughout the museum.
Sure.
And again, is talked about in our classroom exhibit on the second floor.
Now, there's mention in the museum of Fernand Gagnon, somebody we've talked about here, and the whole idea of repatriation. Now, what was that kind of movement about?
Well, the repatriation, we don't have too much here at the museum about that, but there were certainly some farms, some land that was offered to people who wanted to go back. This land, we heard and read about that very often it was not farmland. It was wood. It was out either in the Western Canada or really up north, and very difficult for folks to face. So they many of people felt like the right thing to do was to stay in the United States. There was that back and forth, however, and this is something that people still talk about. Even some of the older residents will remember their grandparents sometimes keeping land up in Canada and going back in the summer and working in the mills at other time of year. So that back and forth went on for a very long time.
Sure. And now moving on to some of the other exhibits, which I think are really cool. Talks a lot about, your museum obviously highlights a lot about kind of what the conditions were, what life was like working in these mills. And one of the things that comes up is the impact of child labor, which absolutely caught my attention. Now, how young were these kids? What are we talking about?
Well, the kids could be as young as 11, 12 years old. A century earlier, in the time of Samuel Slater, who opened the first textile mill here in Pawtucket, children were, used really in the textile industry. Over here, it's a little bit different. Kids on the farms always had jobs.
Sure.
They picked berries in the summer. They helped with the animals. So it was a little, I want to say, almost cultural to involve the family at work. And they still needed to, make enough money to survive here in the United States. So they brought their children. Very often, they were jobs offered for the kids, shorter shifts, and,
Sure.
the kids would come in. But, the accident rates were so high, and it certainly was not a place for children. And apparently it was very easy to, you were supposed to be 14, but you could, take somebody else's, birth certificate, one of your older brother, and show it. And, the foreman might pay attention or might not pay attention. So, yes, children did work in the mills, but it was not until, like, the 1930s that laws against child labor were passed in this country.
Gotcha. And there is significant discussion in the museum about kind of the working conditions. I saw a reference to something we've talked about here with piecework, was something that happened in the mills down there, but also other items related to just their day-to-day existence. I mean, maybe you could give us a picture of what would a day be like? What was it like to work in these mills?
The hours were very long. The conditions were difficult because, it was extremely hot. Opening the windows was not an option because you either let too much dry air in, which is very bad for the threads. So you wanted to keep a certain level of humidity, which, with that, you'd
Sure.
get a lot of dust, and the
Yeah.
dust had no place to go, and, strong smell of oil, and people developed diseases, lung diseases. The machinery was really loud, and you didn't have protection for your ears like we do today. So workers had hearing issues, and there really was not much done to protect workers. So this is what we also talk about here. So the theme goes from, la survivance theme, and then, we do show that, people did not completely forget about their survivance, but that fight that they came, when they first settled, which was really to keep up with their language and their culture and their faith, it started changing gradually, and said, well, maybe we need to really get together and fight for better working conditions. I mean, when you think that a lot of people couldn't read, and
Sure.
They had instructions on how to shut off the machinery when, somebody's arm would get caught in it. But if you can't read, and if you've never had training, it becomes a real issue. So, unions became very instrumental in helping the workers not only attain better salaries and better working conditions, but also with helping them getting their American citizenship, so they could become, U.S. citizens and be able to vote. Because if you want to have your voice heard, you have to be able to vote at those union meetings and so on. So, so the story of the ITU here, which was the Independent Textile Union, is told through our last exhibit.
Yeah, I was about to go there because there is a lot on the ITU, and there's a mention of a strike in 1934, and I was kind of,
Yes.
what was that strike about, and what kind of impact did that have on the entire town, really?
Yeah, the strike was really horrible. It's really depicted in the film that we show in the ITU hall. The National Guard was called, and a young man, a passerby, was killed during the fight. So it was certainly something that people remembered for a very long time. But that was as a reaction of a large mill in the area closing.
Gotcha. Now, before we move on from kind of like the day-to-day working in the mill, one thing I did have to point out, because I thought it was really, really cool, was the fact that your museum makes it very clear that there were very much skilled jobs available to these workers. Because I think a lot of times the impression a lot of people have is that, these workers, they come from farms, they moved out to these mills. Basically, the day they get off a train, they have a job waiting for them, a completely unskilled job waiting for them in a mill, and they work that job for the next, 40 years and retire. But it makes it very clear that there were very important, very skilled jobs, and you guys highlight the job of a loom fixer, which I thought was really neat, because you have a loom fixer's bag, which was awesome for me because my grandfather, my mom's mom, was a loom fixer here in Manchester, which I thought was cool.
Oh yeah! Oh my gosh, that was extremely and very important job and career. And there was room for advancement in the mills. Certainly, when you probably visited our triple decker, which is the inside of a home that is reflected of an apartment of about 1925, 1926, and you can see within this apartment things that people could start affording once you were not necessarily an immigrant that just came in, but you've been around for 5-10 years, and you were able to get up in the ranks, maybe become a foreman, or learning a skill that paid more. So, no, you're absolutely right. There was, room for advancement, and, people could afford to buy, a washing machine or even a telephone.
Yeah, and that's awesome.
So, yeah.
Now, you got in your museum, again, besides just the work, it highlights some of the aspects of life kind of outside the job, but that were super influenced by the job. And I was thinking of, there's mention of company housing, and there's mention of kind of baseball almost serving a purpose for the mill owners when they expose their workers to to baseball. You just talk about a little bit about how even the life outside of their day-to-day job, once they left their shift for the day, was still super influenced by the Mills.
Absolutely. A lot of the Mills had their own baseball team, and that was, number one, America's number one pastime. I think might still be. I don't know if it is. I think football probably took over baseball now, but certainly baseball was very big. And after work or on the weekends, the Mills competed, and it was a great way for the mill owners to keep that sense of developing that sense of belonging to your to your company. But what's really amazing is that out of these teams, some incredible baseball players were born. You might have heard of Napoleon Lajoie.
Absolutely.
Joy.
Yeah.
Yeah, who had a baseball team named after him, became a professional player, still holds some records today that have never been beat. He's in the Cooperstown Hall of Fame. We also have had another Hall of Famer, Gabby Harnett and Clem Labine. So, some of those guys were really exposed to the sports through their work, through their teams. So it was something that everyone enjoyed.
And your museum also talks about another major topic that we've talked a lot about on this podcast, the whole idea of the nativism issue. And there was kind of like a backlash against a lot of these immigrants coming into the States.
They were not always welcome. Certainly, we had other groups who had settled here before. The Irish immigrants had come probably 10 years before the first French-Canadian immigrants started to come. They were here to dig the Blackstone Canal, which the canal was only used for about 10 years prior to the arrival of the railroad. But they had settled in the area. They already had a church, a Catholic church here in Woonsocket. Once the French came, they wanted to have their French Catholic church. So that was, instead of joining the other parish, they felt like they needed to have their own parish. So, there was certainly the division. We don't have any recorded incidents of Ku Klux Klan, like I think happened in Maine and maybe in New Hampshire. I'm not sure, but certainly it was, it was difficult. And again, it's Woonsocket has a lot of very new immigrants coming to the city, and history repeats itself, I should say.
Sure. No, absolutely.
I think we all agree. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned obviously the establishing of the church, and one issue that's, I guess, kind of unique to the Rhode Island story was the whole Sentinel Affair. It was mentioned in the museum. Can you tell us a little bit about what? Because I think that probably deserves an entire episode on its own. But I'm curious as to if you just give us a brief what the Sentinel issue was.
Oh, Le Sentinel, sure. So during probably started around 1922, 1923, the Bishop of Providence, who's Bishop Hickey, decided that there would be a special collection that would take place in church on Sunday, and it was really a big fundraising project that the diocese would do to raise funds to build some higher education schools, such as over here we have Mount St. Charles Academy in the city,
sure.
La Salle in Providence, and he wanted to build these very big Catholic private high schools. And, the French Canadians here gave money each week to keep up with the education of their children in the local parochial schools. And they knew that if they would give their money to the bishop that those schools were not going to continue their tradition of, having a half day in French
Sure.
and learning your catechism in French and l'histoire du Canada, and it was going to be really an English high school. So they decided not to give, and it became a real deep debate between the church and the French Canadians. So a group of people got together and formed what they called themselves the Sentinelists, and they even had, it was very much of an underground movement with, they had a newspaper, and they fought, also very openly against the bishop. They decided to. It's a very long story,
Sure.
but they decided, like as you said, we could have and we do have a specialist here. If you're ever interested, Mr. Paul Bourget has written about the Sentinel. But
Yeah, I'm gonna grab his contact for sure.
yes. So the group decided to sue the bishop, and that didn't work. And they were many parishioners were excommunicated. And there were several French Canadian parishes in Woonsocket, but St. Anne's Parish is where that fight was going on, and many of the parishioners were excommunicated. And back in those days, if you were excommunicated, really you lost your identity. It was like having your identity stolen today. It was just
Right.
extremely, devastating. So in the end, all the parishioners had to obey by the bishop and apologize to the Pope to be reinstated into the Catholic Church.
Yeah, well, like you mentioned, we definitely need to get a whole episode of that because it's super fascinating, super complex. Obviously, it takes place in Rhode Island, but it has major impact well beyond Rhode Island for many people, which is super fascinating. But
Yes.
But going back, just kind of as we wrap up the discussion of like the mill and the mill life, when did the mills really start to decline?
The mills declined. Well, we kind of had two declines here. So very late, probably like 1890s, when the cotton industry really moved south.
Gotcha.
So the cotton mills had closed, and I talked a little bit earlier about Aaron Pothier. Aaron Pothier was the first French Canadian governor of the state of Rhode Island. But prior to being governor, I'd gone to France and brought the French industrialists. So they came here in the very early part of the 1900s, and they opened these mills all over the city, and I really created almost a second industrial revolution for Woonsocket.
That's
So,
awesome.
people got back to work, and we were creating some of the best worsteds. So it was all wool garments, and, that was created. So wool was shipped from all over the world, and they were really work for everyone again. And then we saw a decline towards the end of the 1920s, early 1930s, and then again the war brought in some additional production.
Sure.
So you saw a lot of the mills reopening during World War II to help during the war efforts. And we had even some of the decoys that were used during World War II by the Ghost Army.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever heard of the Ghost
Absolutely.
Army.
Yeah,
but
that's really fascinating.
The army that was used to, to deceive Hitler's army, were, made here at the Alice Mills. So some fake tanks and balloon it was really very interesting, and that information was classified until I believe the 1980s. So there's a great film that was produced by a local producer, which is called the Ghost Army of World War II. And it talks about the Alice Mills.
And what happened to once these mills basically kind of don't rebound to their pre-war life. What happened to all these mill workers here in Woonsocket?
Well, Woonsocket's economy changed gradually to more of a service economy. Luckily, here we are the home of CVS Corporation. So it's right here in the city of Woonsocket, employs thousands and thousands of people. So yeah, gradually, some people. I mean, it's a very, I guess, gradual happening, but it's the city's smaller certainly now than it was. We used to be a city probably in the textiles heyday, 55,000. Now we're about a city of 40,000 people. So the community has changed. We do have one mill that still produces some blankets. They make, it's called the Brickle Group. They've been here in the city for probably over 100 years, and they make all their the garments that they make. Well, they do blankets for the U.S. and Army and Navy. They make berets also for the Army, and they even make the inside of professional baseballs. And they are everything is made from recycled material. So they're very much into sort of the new
Sure.
ways of doing textiles. So it's really amazing company.
That's very cool. Now, again, this museum is an amazing place. I got to tell you, the entire time I walked through, I was just thinking how awesome it was to have kind of a museum dedicated to, my family, to telling my story. Even though I'm not from Woonsocket, but a lot of the stories that you see in these exhibits were very much stories that were told to me growing up in Manchester, and that was just so
I'm
neat.
glad, yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. I do feel that way. I feel like so many people can see themselves in the walls of the museum. Your story, whether you're French Canadian, your heritage like you, or maybe you're someone whose, parents were active in the unions, or
Right.
perhaps, you're an immigrant, even from another ethnic group. I think that, the story is well told, and it's and we get a lot of visitors from Quebec who very often are surprised, didn't know that we had all these enclaves of French Canadian culture all over New England. And I know you want to talk about La Franco Route, but that is one of the goals of the Franco Route to make these cities and towns known to the Francophone communities.
Sure, this is an awesome transition. What is the Franco Route?
So the Franco Route is really a project to link the cities of in New England who share the same heritage, the same stories, and it was easy to identify the big cities. We have Lewiston, Auburn, we have Biddeford in Maine, Manchester, New Hampshire, Woonsocket, Rhode Island. So we started to talk a few years back. Even the conversation about the Franco Route started, believe it or not, in 2008.
Wow.
During the 400th anniversary of the city of Quebec. Many of us throughout New England, with the help of the Quebec delegation, we worked at dedicated a monument to the city of Quebec from the people of New England as a gift to Quebec for the 400th anniversary. We have a beautiful monument. Many people don't know about it, but it's right on the side of, on the St. Lawrence River. As you leave the city and follow le Boulevard Champlain, if you're familiar with Quebec, between the old city and the Quebec Bridge. So there's a beautiful monument there. So we started to talk, there was a lot of momentum, and we thought, boy, wouldn't that be great to continue working together, the cities, and create itineraries and create this route that people could follow and learn about the immigration to Quebec, the Francophone, the Quebecois immigration to New England. So 2 years ago, we met again during the second meeting of les villes francophones et francophiles d'Amérique. Have you heard about this network
No,
that we are part of?
I have not.
Okay, well, Manchester is part of that, and so is Lewiston and Woonsocket and Biddeford. So the mayor of Quebec City um, thought that it would be a good idea for mayors from all over the Americas to get together if you have some type of French history to your city. So it can be French Canadian history, or it could be French from French explorers. It could be any story that you want to share. So if you Google Francophone and Francophile Network, you can find this website where you will see all the cities that are part of this association, this network. We have about probably 125 cities throughout Canada and the United States. So, like I said, we had a meeting 2 years ago, 2 summers ago, in Quebec City, and through again the Quebec delegation, the city of Lewiston and the city of Woonsocket, we signed an agreement to start working on this Franco Route Project. So since then, we have reached to Manchester and to Biddeford, and we are working to develop a website that is going to let visitors, bring visitors to the website to read about the French Canadian or the French history of each city. The website will also highlight the points of interest for each city. We'll also present some itineraries so you can follow this Franco route, whether you come from the south and you want to follow it from Woonsocket and going up the coast to Lewiston and maybe continue on to Quebec City, or you want to start in Quebec City and go through Maine and New Hampshire and come to Woonsocket. Will give people different options. So it is, it's a route that already exists. You can follow, Route 95 or 93 and see our places, but we want to make it a little bit more organized for visitors to, to really plan their trip and to know where to go. And of course, many of our small museums and small organizations, we're not open 7 days a week. Here at the museum, we're lucky to be open 12 months a year, and we're closed on Mondays, but we're open 6 days a week. It's not the same for every organization. So this Franco Route, we really, will give you all the information about, when sites are open and where to go to eat, and where there are bike paths and places where you can go on your, kayaking. And I think it's going to be interesting for people. I'm thinking people from Quebec, again, who don't necessarily know the story of immigration that happened there and where the people went. So I think it'll be very interesting for them to come and discover that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so very much, Anne, for coming on the podcast with us today. But before we let you go, I want to make sure we can give all our listeners kind of some information on how they can find out more about your museum. So if somebody's interested in checking out the museum, where would you send them?
So our website is www.rihs.org. So it's for Rhode Island Historical Society.org. So we have all our information, hours of operation, actually working on a new website. So this one is the new one that's going to roll out within the next 3 or 4 months. Will give a lot more information on the museum per se, but it's a good way to start. And of course, if people can always call us for other information at 401-769-9675.
No, that's awesome. Now, is there guided tours? Or is there events at this museum?
So we do have guided tours for groups of 10 or more.
Nice.
We are presently developing an audio tour which probably within the next 6 to 8 months will be ready for people to follow. As you know, the most of the exhibit are translated into French, so people can follow the tour and read the panels in French. We have events, of course, throughout the year. We have not as big as the Manchester Poutine event, but we do have a Poutine event here too. So in each March, I should say each year during the month of March, we celebrate La Francophonie in New England, and it's celebrated throughout New England. And here at the museum, we do an event, which is usually the third Sunday of March, called Bonjour Printemps, and that's when we feature our poutine competition. So last year, we had 7 restaurants and food trucks competing. It was a sold-out event. We had to turn people away, which we don't like to do. But being in March, we can't really be outside because of the weather.
Sure.
So, but we'll announce the event again probably early in January, so people need to get their tickets early.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for joining us on the podcast, Dan. It's an awesome museum. It was very, very cool to be able to talk to you.
Well, my pleasure.
Now our fathers look at us and sigh with despair, to think that everything they love we simply do not share. But the spirit never dies, our culture will survive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive.
Special thanks to Josie Vachon for providing the music. You can find more about her at josievachon.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Mike Campbell. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at fclpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at FCL Podcast for more information about the topics discussed. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this episode.